The fist came out of nowhere. It was the summer of 1982, and the stench of stale beer and sweat hung heavy in the corridors beneath the Hammersmith Odeon in London, where Motorhead was scheduled to take the stage in less than 40 minutes. Phil Taylor, the man they called Filthy Animal, had been drinking since noon, and his eyes carried that particular kind of darkness that everyone in the crew had learned to fear. Lemmy Kilmister was standing near the dressing room mirror, adjusting the bullet belt that hung across his chest, when Taylor's knuckles connected with the left side of his jaw so hard that the bass player stumbled sideways into a stack of Marshall amplifier heads. The crack of bone against bone echoed through that concrete hallway, and for a moment, the only sound was the distant rumble of 4,000 fans chanting the band's name above them, completely unaware that the most dangerous partnership in heavy metal was shattering into pieces beneath their feet. What happened in the next 30 minutes would push Lemmy to the edge of a decision he had been avoiding for years, and the consequences of that single punch would ripple through the band's history for the next 3 decades, leaving wounds that were still bleeding on the night Phil Taylor took his last breath in November of 2015, just 47 days before Lemmy followed him into the silence. If this story hits you the way it should, take a second and subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you never miss another deep dive into the untold stories of rock and roll. The two strays who built a war machine asterisk. To understand why that punch landed with the weight of a decade of fury behind it, you have to go back to 1975, to a grimy rehearsal space in London, where a freshly fired bass player was looking for the loudest drummer alive. Lemmy had just been thrown out of Hawkwind after getting busted at the Canadian border with amphetamines that customs officers mistook for cocaine. He was broke, humiliated, and burning with the kind of rage that either destroys a man or turns him into something unstoppable. The music industry had already written him off. At 29 years old, with a drug habit that would have killed most people and a reputation for being impossible to work with, Lemmy Kilmister should have been finished. Instead, he walked into that rehearsal room with a Rickenbacker bass slung over his shoulder, and a vision for a band so loud, so fast, and so relentless that it would make every other group on the planet sound like they were playing underwater. The only problem was finding musicians insane enough to keep up with him, and that search led him to a 20-year-old kid from Chesterfield named Philip John Taylor, a drummer with hands like pistons, and a personality that made Lemmy look like a librarian by comparison. Phil Taylor had been playing in local bands around the Midland circuit, going nowhere fast, drinking everything he could get his hands on, and getting into fights that left him with scars across his knuckles that never fully healed. When he showed up to audition for Lemmy's new project, he hit the drums so hard that the snare stand collapsed within the first 2 minutes, and Lemmy knew instantly that he had found his other half. The chemistry between them was immediate, violent, and electric. They shared the same appetite for speed, both the drug and the tempo, and neither of them had any interest in playing music that gave the audience time to breathe. Within weeks, they had recruited guitarist Larry Wallies, and then, crucially, Eddie Clark, the man who would complete the holy trinity of the classic Motorhead lineup, and the three of them began rehearsing in a space so small that the volume alone cracked the plaster on the walls. A brotherhood forged in volume and chaos. The early years of Motorhead were a masterclass in survival through sheer stubbornness. Nobody wanted to sign them. Record labels sent representatives to their shows who left with bleeding ears and no desire to return. The music press called them unlistenable, a joke, 3 men making noise that served no purpose other than giving their neighbors migraines. But Lemmy and Phil and Eddie kept playing, kept touring, kept showing up to venues where the promoters sometimes forgot to pay them, and the dressing room smelled like sewage. What held them together through those years of rejection was something deeper than friendship. It was a shared understanding that they were building something the world was not ready for but would eventually have no choice but to accept. Phil Taylor was the engine room of that machine. His drumming was not technical in the way jazz purists admired, and it was not flashy in the way arena rock demanded. It was primal, thunderous, and absolutely relentless, a style that sounded like someone had strapped a jackhammer to a motorcycle and pointed it at your chest. He played with a fury that matched Lemmy's bass attack beat for beat, and together they created a wall of sound so dense that it physically moved the air in the room. Eddie Clarke added the melody and the fire on top, but the foundation was always Lemmy and Phil, locked together in a rhythmic partnership that felt less like music and more like a controlled demolition. The bond between the bassist and the drummer went beyond the stage. They drank together, they took speed together, they got into trouble together, and they protected each other with the fierce loyalty of two men who had nothing in the world except the noise they made. But inside that loyalty was a ticking bomb that neither of them acknowledged, because the same intensity that made their music extraordinary also made their personal relationship a powder keg waiting for a spark. The Ace of Spades and the Price of Glory. When Motorhead finally broke through with the Ace of Spades album in 1980, everything changed and nothing changed at the same time. The record hit number 4 on the UK charts. The title track became an anthem that defined an entire genre, and suddenly the three men who had been sleeping on floors and eating from gas stations were selling out arenas across Europe. But success did not soften the edges of the band. If anything, it sharpened them. The money meant more drugs, more alcohol, more nights that ended with furniture destroyed and relationships shattered. Phil Taylor's drinking escalated from heavy to catastrophic during this period, and the speed that had once fueled his superhuman drumming performances began to eat away at his ability to function as a human being between shows. He would disappear for days at a time, showing up to sound checks looking like he had crawled out of a grave, his hands shaking so badly that the roadies would have to tape the sticks to his fingers before he could play. Lemmy watched all of this with the complicated mixture of concern and contempt that defined his approach to weakness. He was no stranger to excess himself, of course. The man had been drinking a bottle of Jack Daniels every day since the early 70s and consuming enough amphetamines to power a small city. But Lemmy had a constitution that medical science could not explain, a body that seemed to absorb punishment the way other bodies absorbed vitamins, and he expected everyone around him to operate at the same level of functional destruction. When Phil began missing rehearsals, when his timing on stage started slipping by fractions of a second that only Lemmy's ears could detect, the frustration between them began to curdle into something toxic. And Eddie Clarke, trapped between these two volatile personalities like a man standing between two oncoming trains, found himself increasingly alienated from a band that had once felt like a family. The night everything cracked asterisk. The tensions that had been building for months finally detonated on that summer night beneath the Hammersmith Odeon in 1982. The details of what triggered the punch depend on who you ask. The roadies who were there have told different versions of the story for decades, each one adding layers of detail that may or may not be true. What is certain is that Phil Taylor had been in a black mood all day, drinking bourbon in the back of the tour bus while the rest of the crew loaded equipment into the venue. Some accounts say the argument started over a woman, a groupie who had been seen leaving Lemmy's hotel room the night before, and who Phil believed had been promised to him. Others say it was about money, about royalty splits that Phil felt were unfair, about the fact that Lemmy's name was always first in every interview and every headline while the drummer and guitarist who made the music possible were treated like hired help. And still others insist it was simpler than that Phil was just drunk and angry, and Lemmy said the wrong thing at the wrong moment, something dismissive about Phil's playing on the previous night's show, and the fuse that had been burning for years finally reached the dynamite. Whatever the cause, the result was Phil Taylor's fist slamming into the side of Lemmy Kilmister's face with enough force to send the biggest man in heavy metal stumbling into amplifier heads that crashed to the floor like dominoes. The dressing room went silent. The roadies froze. Eddie Clark, who had been tuning his guitar in the corner, looked up with an expression that witnesses later described as the face of a man who had been waiting for this moment and dreading it in equal measure. 40 minutes to showtime. What happened next became one of the most legendary untold stories in Motorhead's history. Lemmy straightened up, touched the corner of his mouth where blood was already pooling against his signature mole, and stared at Phil Taylor with an expression that the tour manager would later describe as the coldest thing he had ever seen in 30 years of working with rock bands. There was no shouting, no retaliation, no explosive return of violence. Lemmy simply looked at the man who had been his musical partner for 7 years, the man who had helped him build Motorhead from nothing, and said nothing at all. The silence lasted an eternity, maybe 10 seconds, maybe 30. Nobody could agree afterward, and then Lemmy turned away and walked to the far side of the dressing room where his bass was leaning against the wall. He picked up the Rickenbacker, checked the tuning, and began running through the opening riff of Iron Fist with his back to the room. Phil Taylor stood there with his fist still clenched, swaying slightly, the rage on his face slowly dissolving into something that looked like confusion, and then, unmistakably, fear. He had crossed a line that he knew could never be uncrossed, and the fact that Lemmy had not hit him back was somehow worse than any punch could have been. The tour manager stepped between them and began the desperate work of getting 3 men who could barely stand to be in the same room onto a stage in front of 4,000 paying customers. The show, incredibly, went ahead. Motorhead played for 90 minutes that night with the kind of ferocity that made reviewers use words like volcanic and unhinged, and not a single person in the audience had any idea that the band was disintegrating in real time behind the wall of sound. The fracture that would not heal. But the damage was done, and the aftershocks of that punch radiated through Motorhead for years. Eddie Clark left the band just months later, unable to tolerate the tension between Lemmy and Phil any longer, and his departure marked the end of the classic lineup that had produced every record that mattered. The official story was creative differences, a disagreement over the band's collaboration with Wendy O. Williams and the Plasmatics on the Stand By Your Man single, but everyone close to the band knew the real reason. Eddie had watched his 2 partners become enemies wearing the disguise of friends, and he wanted no part of the explosion he knew was coming. With Clark gone, Lemmy and Phil brought in new guitarists and kept touring, kept recording, kept filling venues with that trademark Motorhead thunder, but something essential had been lost. The spontaneity, the joy, the reckless abandon that had defined their early work was replaced by a professional competence that sounded right but felt wrong. Phil's drinking continued to worsen, and his relationship with Lemmy deteriorated into a cycle of confrontation and cold silence that the rest of the band learned to navigate the way sailors navigate storms, by keeping their heads down and hopping to survive. The punch at Hammersmith was never discussed between them. It existed in the space between Lemmy and Phil like a ghost that both men could see but neither would acknowledge, and with each passing year, the weight of that unspoken moment grew heavier. The Exile and the Emptiness asterisk. In 1992, after 17 years of partnership, Lemmy made the decision he had been avoiding since that night under the Hammersmith Odeon. He fired Phil Taylor from Motorhead. The reasons given publicly were about Phil's declining health and his inability to keep up with the touring schedule, but the people who were there knew it was about something deeper, something that went back to that fist connecting with Lemmy's jaw and the silence that followed. Phil Taylor did not take the firing well. He retreated into a fog of alcohol and bitterness that consumed the next decade of his life, living in increasingly shabby apartments, selling off his drum equipment piece by piece to pay for the habits that were slowly killing him. The rock and roll world moved on without him. And the cruelty of that forgetting was perhaps the deepest wound of all. Here was a man who had helped create one of the most important bands in the history of heavy music, whose drumming had influenced everyone from Lars Ulrich to Dave Grohl, and yet he was living in obscurity while Motorhead continued touring with replacements who could play his parts, but could never replicate his fury. Lemmy never publicly criticized Phil during those years of exile. In interviews, he would give clipped, careful answers that revealed nothing of the pain underneath, saying things about Phil being a great drummer who lost his way, and the interviewers would move on, never knowing that behind those guarded words was a man grieving a partnership that had meant more to him than he would ever admit. The return that changed nothing asterisk. Phil Taylor came back to Motorhead in 1987 for a reunion that produced the Rock and Roll album, but each return was haunted by the same patterns that had driven them apart. Lemmy wanted the old Phil, the 20-year-old kid with hands like pistons who could play for 2 hours without breaking a sweat, and what he got was a man in his 40s whose body was paying the price for 2 decades of relentless abuse. Phil wanted the old respect, the sense that he was an equal partner in the engine room of the loudest band on earth, and what he got was the growing feeling that he was a guest in his own creation. They would have moments of the old magic on stage, where the muscle memory of 1,000 shows would take over, and they would lock into that primal rhythmic partnership that nobody else could replicate. But off stage, the silences between them grew longer and colder, and the crew learned to read the atmosphere the way animals read the weather, sensing when a storm was about to break and finding shelter before the lightning hit. The final firing and 30 years of silence. When Lemmy fired Phil for the last time in 1992, there were no dramatic scenes, no punches, no screaming matches in hotel corridors. It was done quietly, almost gently, as if both men understood that the relationship had finally exhausted itself. Phil packed his equipment, said goodbye to the crew members who had become his closest friends, and walked out of the Motorhead world for what everyone assumed would be the last time. The years that followed were difficult for both of them. Lemmy kept Motorhead running with new musicians, producing albums that were consistently good if never quite reaching the devastating heights of the classic era, and touring with a relentless schedule that seemed designed to fill the silence left by the friends who were no longer there. Phil drifted through the margins of the music world, playing in small bands, giving occasional interviews where he would alternate between bitter criticism of Lemmy and heartfelt praise for the music they had made together. The rock press would ask Lemmy about Phil from time to time, and his answers became increasingly brief, a wall of words designed to protect something fragile underneath. What nobody on the outside could see was that both men were carrying the same wound, the knowledge that the greatest creative partnership of their lives had been destroyed not by a single punch, but by the accumulated weight of 2 personalities too similar to coexist and too bonded to fully separate. The phone calls nobody heard asterisk. In the final years, there were phone calls. Not many and never long, but they happened. Lemmy would ring Phil late at night from his apartment on Larrabee Street in West Hollywood, sometimes sober, often not, and they would talk about the old days with the careful distance of 2 veterans discussing a war they had both survived. They never talked about the punch. They never talked about the firings. They talked about the music, about that night at Hammersmith when the PA system blew and they played the last 3 songs acoustically, and the crowd went absolutely insane, about the recording session for Ace of Spades, where the takes were so fast that the tape engineer thought the machine was malfunctioning. These conversations were brief and guarded, 2 proud men reaching across a divide they had spent decades building, and each one ended the same way, with a pause that lasted just a beat too long, and then a gruff goodbye that carried the weight of everything they would never say. Phil's health was deteriorating rapidly during this period. The decades of alcohol abuse had taken a devastating toll on his liver, and he was in and out of hospitals with increasing frequency, each visit leaving him weaker than the last. Lemmy knew all of this through the network of friends and former roadies who kept him informed, and the knowledge sat in his chest like a stone that he carried everywhere but never put down. November 11, 2015. Phil Taylor died on November 11, 2015, at the age of 61. The cause was liver failure, the inevitable conclusion of a lifetime of drinking that had begun in the rehearsal rooms of Chesterfield, and ended in a hospital bed that was too quiet for a man who had spent his life surrounded by the loudest sound on earth. When Lemmy received the news, the people who were with him said something broke behind his eyes that they had never seen before. This was a man who had buried more friends than most people make in a lifetime, who had watched the rock and roll generation fall one by one to the same excesses he had somehow survived, and yet the death of Phil Taylor hit him differently. It was the death of the other half of an argument that had never been resolved, the permanent silencing of a voice that Lemmy had been fighting with and fighting for since 1975. In the days that followed, Lemmy gave a handful of interviews about Phil, and for the first time in decades, the guard came down. He spoke about the drummer with a tenderness that startled everyone, calling him the best he had ever played with, acknowledging the pain they had caused each other, and admitting that losing Phil felt like losing a part of himself that he would never get back. 47 days. Lemmy Kilmister died on December 28, 2015, 47 days after Phil Taylor. He was 70 years old, 4 days past his birthday, and the aggressive prostate cancer that killed him had only been diagnosed 2 days before his death. The speed of his decline shocked everyone who knew him, though perhaps it should not have. There is a theory, not medical but deeply human, that some people hold on until the last thread connecting them to the world is severed, and then they simply let go. For Lemmy, that thread might have been the unfinished business with Phil Taylor, the punch that was never discussed, the apology that was never made. The reconciliation that both men wanted but neither could bring themselves to initiate. With Phil gone, there was nothing left to resolve, nothing left to fight for, and the body that had defied medical science for 50 years of Jack Daniels and amphetamines finally surrendered. The two men who had built the loudest, fastest, most uncompromising band in the history of heavy metal died within 7 weeks of each other, as if even death could not separate the partnership that life had tried so hard to destroy. And Eddie Clark, the third member of that holy trinity, followed them in January of 2018, completing the circle and closing the book on a chapter of rock and roll that will never be written again. The fist that connected with Lemmy's jaw on that summer night in 1982 echoed through 33 years of music, silence, exile, and loss. And in the end, the only thing louder than the punch was the silence that followed when there was no one left to remember what it sounded like.